In the frozen wilderness of North America, where ancient pines stretch toward grey skies and the wind carries whispers older than memory, there exists a terror so profound that indigenous peoples would rather starve than speak its name aloud. It is a creature born not from imagination, but from the darkest corners of human desperation. A monster that was once human itself. You might think you know this story. You might believe it's just another campfire tale, another horror movie villain designed to sell tickets and give teenagers nightmares. But you would be wrong. The entity we're about to explore is far more than folklore. It is a warning carved into the collective memory of an entire continent, a psychological map of what happens when civilization breaks down and humanity devours itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And if you're listening right now, share your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Deep in the forests of the Great Lakes region, where winter can last for 8 months and temperatures plunge to depths that can kill in minutes, the Algonquian peoples developed one of the most sophisticated and terrifying mythologies ever conceived. At its center stands a being whose very name was considered so dangerous that many tribes forbade its utterance during the winter months. They called it the Wendigo. But here's what makes this different from every other monster story you've ever heard. The Wendigo wasn't just something that hunted humans. It was something that humans became. It was the ultimate cautionary tale about crossing a line from which there could be no return. And the more we dig into the historical accounts, the archaeological evidence, and the psychological research, the more we discover that this ancient terror might have been describing something very real indeed. What we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about monsters, about survival, and about the thin veneer of civilization that separates us from our most primal instincts. We're going to journey into the heart of a mystery that spans thousands of years, crosses multiple disciplines, and reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature that we'd rather keep buried. This isn't just the story of a monster. This is the story of what happens when the human mind breaks under pressure so intense that reality itself begins to fracture. And the terrifying part? It's still happening today. To understand the true horror of the Wendigo, we must first understand the world that created it. Picture, if you will, the vast boreal forests of North America 500 years ago, endless stretches of spruce, fir, and pine, punctuated by frozen lakes that stretch beyond the horizon. This is a landscape where survival depends on perfect knowledge of the seasonal cycles, where a single mistake can mean death for an entire family. The Algonquian peoples who inhabited this region, tribes like the Ojibwe, Cree, and Innu, had developed over millennia one of the most sophisticated survival cultures in human history. They understood every aspect of this harsh environment, from the migration patterns of caribou to the subtle signs that predicted the severity of coming winters. Their oral traditions weren't just stories. They were survival manuals, encoded in narrative form, passed down through generations with meticulous precision. But even with all their knowledge, even with their deep spiritual connection to the land, there were winters that tested the very limits of human endurance. Winters when the game disappeared, when the fish died under thick ice, when the stored provisions ran out, and families faced a choice that no human being should ever have to make. It was during these times of ultimate desperation that the Wendigo was born. Not as a supernatural entity floating down from some ethereal realm, but as a psychological transformation that could overtake anyone pushed beyond their breaking point. The Wendigo, in its original conception, was what happened when a person consumed human flesh out of starvation and crossed a threshold from which their humanity could never return. The transformation was described as both physical and spiritual. The person would develop an insatiable hunger that could never be satisfied, no matter how much they consumed. Their body would become gaunt and towering, Their skin would take on a greyish pallor, and their eyes would sink deep into their skull, glowing with an unnatural light. Most disturbing of all, they would lose all recognition of family, friends, and tribal bonds. They became a predator that saw other humans only as prey. But here's where the story becomes truly chilling. The Wendigo wasn't just a cautionary tale about cannibalism. It was a sophisticated understanding of what we now call Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound psychiatric syndrome that was documented by early explorers, missionaries, and later by anthropologists and psychiatrists. People actually transformed into the monster. They actually became what the stories described. The first recorded European encounter with this phenomenon came in 1636, when a French missionary named Paul Lejeune documented a case among the Montagnais people. A man named Awashish had begun exhibiting signs of what the tribe recognized as Wendigo transformation. He claimed to have an insatiable craving for human flesh, insisted that he could see a creature of ice and wind following him, and begged his own people to kill him before he harmed someone. Lejeune, writing with the clinical detachment of a 17th century observer, described how the man's appearance had changed dramatically. His face had become drawn and hollow, his behavior erratic and violent, and he spoke constantly of his hunger for human meat. The tribe, recognizing the signs, made the terrible decision to execute him before he could complete his transformation and threaten the community. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the historical record, from the 1600s through the early 1900s, there are documented cases of Wendigo psychosis occurring across the Great Lakes region and the Canadian subarctic. The symptoms were remarkably consistent: an obsessive craving for human flesh, paranoid delusions about being followed by supernatural entities, dramatic physical changes including weight loss and altered facial features, and a complete breakdown of social inhibitions and family bonds. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is their connection to real survival situations. Almost invariably, Wendigo psychosis emerged during periods of extreme privation, when communities were facing starvation and had exhausted all other food sources. It was as if the human mind, when pushed to its absolute limit, could break in a very specific way that the indigenous peoples of the region had been observing and categorizing for thousands of years. Dr. Morton Teicher, a psychiatrist who studied the phenomenon in the mid-20th century, identified over 70 documented cases of Wendigo psychosis in the historical record. What struck him most was the precision with which indigenous communities could predict and identify the onset of the condition. They had developed sophisticated protocols for dealing with individuals showing early symptoms, ranging from spiritual interventions to, in extreme cases, execution to protect the community. The most famous case, and perhaps the most thoroughly documented, occurred in 1878 and involved a Cree trapper named Swift Runner. During a particularly harsh winter, Swift Runner and his family became stranded without food in the wilderness north of Fort Saskatchewan. When rescue finally arrived in the spring, they found Swift Runner alone and well-fed, with evidence that he had killed and consumed his wife and 5 of his 6 children. What made this case extraordinary wasn't just the crime itself, but Swift Runner's behavior afterward. He showed no remorse or recognition of his actions as morally wrong. Instead, he spoke obsessively about his continued hunger and his need to find more human flesh. He described visions of a giant creature made of ice and shadow that had told him that human meat was the only food that could truly satisfy him. The Canadian authorities, applying European legal standards, tried Swift Runner for murder. But the indigenous communities in the region understood this as something else entirely. This wasn't a crime of passion, or even of desperate survival. This was a complete psychological transformation, a crossing of a line that separated the human from the inhuman. Swift Runner was executed for his crimes, but his case became a touchstone for understanding the reality behind the Wendigo myth. Here was clear evidence that the stories weren't just metaphorical warnings about the dangers of cannibalism. They were describing a real psychological phenomenon that could overtake individuals under extreme stress. But the question remains, what was actually happening to these people? Was this purely a psychological breakdown triggered by extreme circumstances? Or was there something more complex at work? To find the answer, we need to dig deeper into both the spiritual beliefs of the Algonquian peoples and the cutting-edge research in psychology and neuroscience that's beginning to shed light on how extreme trauma can literally rewire the human brain. The Algonquian understanding of the Wendigo was far more sophisticated than early European observers realized. To them, the creature wasn't just a monster, it was a spiritual disease, a corruption of the soul that could be transmitted through contact with cursed objects, through dreams, or through consuming the flesh of someone who had already been infected. They believed that every human being possessed multiple souls, and that trauma, especially the trauma of violating fundamental taboos like cannibalism, could cause these souls to become imbalanced or corrupted. The Wendigo transformation occurred when the animal soul, the part of human consciousness connected to survival instincts and physical needs, completely overwhelmed the human soul, the part connected to social bonds, moral reasoning, and spiritual awareness. This wasn't just primitive superstition. Modern research into trauma and its effects on the brain is revealing that extreme stress can indeed cause fundamental changes in neural structure and function. The areas of the brain responsible for empathy, moral reasoning, and social bonding can be literally damaged by prolonged exposure to life-threatening situations. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's groundbreaking research on epigenetic trauma has shown that severe psychological stress can actually alter gene expression in ways that can be passed down to subsequent generations. People who have experienced extreme trauma don't just carry psychological scars, they carry biological changes that affect how their brains process fear, hunger, and social connections. When we apply this modern understanding to the historical cases of Wendigo psychosis, a disturbing picture emerges. These weren't just isolated incidents of temporary madness brought on by starvation. They were systematic breakdowns of human psychological architecture, occurring in predictable patterns that Indigenous communities had been observing and documenting for millennia. The physical changes described in Wendigo transformation, the gaunt appearance, the sunken eyes, the altered facial structure, are consistent with what we now know about the effects of extreme malnutrition on the human body. But the psychological changes, the loss of empathy, the obsessive focus on consumption, the inability to recognize family and social bonds, these point to something far more complex than simple starvation. We're looking at a condition where extreme environmental pressure, cultural taboo violation, and neurological trauma combine to create a complete breakdown of human identity. The person didn't just become hungry, they became something that was no longer recognizably human in their behavior, their reasoning, or their social connections. And this is where the story becomes truly terrifying. Because the conditions that created the Wendigo haven't disappeared. They've simply moved to different contexts, different environments, different cultures. The same psychological mechanisms that produced Wendigo psychosis in the 17th century Algonquian communities are still operating today, creating monsters in modern settings that we're only beginning to recognize and understand. The connection between historical Wendigo cases and modern psychological phenomena becomes chillingly clear when we examine contemporary research into what scientists now call pathological cannibalism. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist who has studied modern cases of anthropophagy, has identified patterns that mirror almost exactly what Indigenous communities observed centuries ago. In her analysis of criminal cases from the past 50 years, she found that individuals who engage in cannibalistic behavior often report experiencing what they describe as an overwhelming compulsion, a hunger that normal food cannot satisfy. They speak of crossing a psychological threshold, after which their perception of other human beings fundamentally changes. Most disturbing of all, many report that the act of consuming human flesh triggers not revulsion, but a sense of euphoria and power that becomes increasingly difficult to resist. Take the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, perhaps the most studied cannibalistic serial killer in modern history. His psychiatric evaluations revealed a progression that bears striking similarities to historical Wendigo accounts. Dahmer described his initial act of cannibalism as born from desperation, a twisted attempt to prevent his victims from leaving him. But he reported that once he had crossed that line, something fundamental shifted in his psychology. He began to experience what he called an insatiable need that grew stronger with each violation. His appearance became increasingly gaunt and hollow-eyed. His social connections deteriorated completely, and he developed an obsessive focus on consumption that dominated every aspect of his thinking. When captured, psychological evaluations revealed severe damage to the areas of his brain responsible for empathy and social bonding. Changes that neuroscientists now know can result from repeated engagement in extremely traumatic behaviors. But Dahmer's case, while extreme, is not unique. Across cultures and throughout history, we find remarkably consistent patterns in individuals who have engaged in cannibalistic behavior. The initial crossing of the taboo, followed by psychological changes that make the behavior increasingly compulsive, leading to a complete breakdown of normal human social functioning. Dr. James Fallon, a neuroscientist who has spent decades studying the brains of psychopaths and violent criminals, made a disturbing discovery when he began examining brain scans of individuals who had engaged in cannibalistic behavior. The neural patterns were virtually identical to those found in the most severe cases of psychopathy, but with one crucial difference. While psychopaths are often born with abnormal brain structure, cannibalistic individuals showed clear evidence of acquired brain damage, changes that occurred after their initial violation of the cannibalistic taboo. This suggests that the Algonquian understanding of Wendigo transformation as a spiritual disease may have been remarkably accurate from a neurological perspective. The act of consuming human flesh appears to cause literal changes in brain chemistry and structure, creating a feedback loop that makes the behavior increasingly compulsive, while simultaneously destroying the neural mechanisms that normally inhibit such actions. But the modern manifestation of Wendigo psychology extends far beyond criminal cannibalism. Contemporary researchers have identified what they call Wendigo syndrome in a variety of contexts, where extreme consumption becomes pathologically compulsive. The same psychological mechanisms that once created literal man-eaters now manifest in different forms of destructive overconsumption. Dr. Susan Albers, who studies eating disorders and compulsive consumption, has noted that certain forms of extreme binge eating disorder exhibit patterns remarkably similar to historical Wendigo cases. Individuals report an insatiable hunger that no amount of normal food can satisfy, accompanied by a progressive loss of social connections and a complete breakdown of normal behavioral inhibitions. In the most severe cases, sufferers describe feeling as though they are no longer human, that they have become something monstrous and unrecognizable. Even more disturbing are the cases that have emerged in areas of extreme poverty and social breakdown, where modern humans face survival pressures similar to those experienced by indigenous communities during harsh winters. In regions affected by severe famine, war, or societal collapse, researchers have documented cases of what they term survival cannibalism that follow patterns almost identical to historical Wendigo accounts. During the siege of Leningrad in World War II, Soviet authorities documented hundreds of cases of cannibalism among the starving population. But what made these cases particularly chilling was not just the act itself, but the psychological transformation that survivors described in those who had crossed that line. Individuals who had resorted to consuming human flesh were reported to undergo dramatic personality changes, becoming increasingly isolated, aggressive, and focused obsessively on obtaining more food by any means necessary. Similar patterns emerged during the Chinese famine of 1959 to 1961, the Cambodian genocide, and more recently during the breakdown of social order in parts of war-torn Africa. In each case, the progression followed the same terrifying pattern: initial cannibalism born from desperation, followed by psychological changes that made the behavior compulsive, leading to a complete breakdown of normal human social functioning. What makes these modern cases particularly disturbing is how they reveal the universality of the Wendigo transformation. This isn't a phenomenon unique to Algonquian culture or to the specific environmental pressures of the North American subarctic. It appears to be a fundamental aspect of human psychology, a breaking point that exists within all of us, waiting to be triggered by the right combination of extreme circumstances. Dr. Roy Baumeister, a social psychologist who has studied the breakdown of moral inhibitions, argues that the Wendigo represents what he calls the moral event horizon of human behavior. Just as nothing can escape from beyond the event horizon of a black hole, humans who cross certain psychological boundaries may find themselves unable to return to normal moral functioning. His research suggests that the consumption of human flesh represents such a profound violation of fundamental human taboos that it triggers irreversible changes in psychological structure. The individual doesn't just commit a horrific act, they fundamentally alter their own neural architecture in ways that make future violations increasingly likely and increasingly severe. This understanding reframes the Wendigo from a supernatural monster into something far more terrifying. A map of human psychological fragility. The creature represents not something external that hunts us, but something internal that we can become when pushed beyond our breaking point. It is the shadow of our own potential for transformation into something monstrous. But the story becomes even more complex when we examine the role that isolation plays in Wendigo transformation. Historical accounts consistently describe individuals who develop the condition as having become increasingly cut off from their communities, either through physical separation or through the breakdown of social bonds. This isolation appears to be both a contributing factor to the transformation and a result of it. Modern research into the psychological effects of extreme isolation supports this connection. Studies of individuals who have experienced prolonged solitary confinement, extreme social isolation, or separation from all familiar social structures show patterns of psychological breakdown that mirror many aspects of Wendigo accounts. Subjects report distorted perceptions of reality, obsessive thoughts about consumption or survival, and a progressive loss of empathy and social connection. The Stanford prison experiment, despite its ethical problems, revealed how quickly normal individuals could transform into something monstrous when removed from their usual social constraints and placed in extreme situations. Within days, participants began exhibiting behaviors that they themselves later described as inhuman, suggesting that the capacity for Wendigo-like transformation exists much closer to the surface of human psychology than most of us would like to believe. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Wendigo phenomenon: its contagious nature. Historical accounts consistently describe the condition as something that could spread from person to person, not through supernatural means, but through a kind of psychological infection. Individuals who came into close contact with someone undergoing Wendigo transformation often began to exhibit similar symptoms, creating cascading breakdowns within entire communities. Modern psychology has identified similar phenomena in what researchers call behavioral contagion or social contagion. When individuals are exposed to extreme antisocial behavior, especially in high-stress survival situations, they can begin to adopt similar behavioral patterns through a process of psychological modeling. The breakdown of one person's moral inhibitions can trigger similar breakdowns in others, creating a domino effect that can destroy entire social structures. This understanding explains why Indigenous communities develop such elaborate protocols for dealing with suspected Wendigo cases. They weren't just responding to individual threats. They were trying to prevent the psychological contagion from spreading and destroying their entire social fabric. The decision to execute individuals showing signs of transformation wasn't just about eliminating a physical threat. It was about preventing the psychological infection from taking hold in others. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond historical curiosity. If the Wendigo represents a real psychological phenomenon that can be triggered by extreme circumstances, then we need to ask ourselves, What conditions in our modern world might be creating similar transformations? And how would we recognize them if they were happening right in front of us? The answer to that question is more disturbing than you might expect, because when we look at the conditions that historically triggered Wendigo transformations, we find that many of them are not only present in our modern world, they're actually intensifying. Consider the psychological profile of someone susceptible to Wendigo transformation: prolonged isolation, extreme stress, the breakdown of traditional social support systems, and exposure to situations where normal moral boundaries become blurred or meaningless. Does any of that sound familiar? Because it should. These are increasingly common features of modern life. Take the phenomenon of social media addiction, something that affects millions of people worldwide. Researchers studying severe cases have identified patterns that are eerily reminiscent of historical Wendigo accounts. Individuals report an insatiable hunger for validation and attention that no amount of likes, shares, or comments can truly satisfy. They describe feeling increasingly disconnected from real human relationships while simultaneously becoming obsessed with consuming more and more digital content. In the most extreme cases, people lose the ability to form meaningful connections with family and friends, viewing other humans primarily as sources of content or validation, rather than as complete individuals worthy of empathy and respect. Their physical appearance often changes dramatically, becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed from lack of sleep and proper nutrition as they spend increasing amounts of time feeding their digital hunger. Dr. Anna Lembke, who studies addiction and compulsive behaviors, has noted that the neurological patterns observed in severe social media addiction show striking similarities to those found in other forms of pathological consumption. The same reward pathways that once drove our ancestors to seek food during times of scarcity are now being hijacked by digital platforms designed to create endless, never-satisfied craving. But the connection goes deeper than simple addiction. The isolation that characterizes modern life, the breakdown of traditional community structures, and the increasing atomization of human relationships are creating conditions remarkably similar to those that historically produced Wendigo transformations. We're witnessing the emergence of what some researchers are calling digital cannibalism, where people consume each other's privacy, dignity, and humanity in pursuit of their own psychological needs. Consider the phenomenon of cyberbullying taken to its extreme. Individuals who engage in systematic online harassment often describe a progression that mirrors historical Wendigo accounts. What begins as minor cruelty gradually escalates into something more consuming and compulsive. They report feeling energized and empowered by causing psychological harm to others, and over time, they lose the ability to see their victims as fully human. The anonymity and distance provided by digital platforms removes many of the social constraints that normally inhibit such behavior, creating conditions where moral boundaries can dissolve rapidly. Just as historical Wendigo cases often occurred during times when normal social structures had broken down, modern digital environments provide spaces where the usual rules of human interaction no longer apply. Even more concerning are the documented cases of what researchers call influence cannibalism in online communities. This occurs when individuals become so obsessed with gaining followers, views, or engagement that they begin systematically destroying other people's reputations, relationships, or mental health to feed their own need for attention and validation. The consumption becomes increasingly compulsive, the methods increasingly extreme, and the ability to empathize with victims progressively diminishes. Dr. Sherry Turkle, who has spent decades studying the psychological impact of digital technology, argues that we're witnessing a fundamental transformation in how humans relate to each other. The constant pressure to present curated versions of ourselves online, combined with the addictive nature of digital validation, is creating what she calls tethered selves. that are increasingly disconnected from authentic human experience. But perhaps the most chilling modern manifestation of Wendigo psychology appears in the realm of consumer capitalism itself. The system that drives our economy is built on the premise of endless consumption, of appetites that can never truly be satisfied. We're encouraged to consume not just material goods, but experiences, relationships, and even other people's labor and creativity in ways that bear striking similarities to the insatiable hunger described in Wendigo accounts. Consider the phenomenon of hustle culture, where individuals become so obsessed with productivity and success that they begin to view other humans primarily as resources to be exploited. People report feeling driven by an hunger for achievement that no amount of success can satisfy. They describe crossing moral lines they once thought were absolute, justifying increasingly predatory behavior in pursuit of their goals. The physical and psychological toll is remarkably similar to historical Wendigo descriptions. Chronic stress and sleep deprivation create the gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance. The constant focus on consumption and acquisition leads to the breakdown of meaningful relationships. Most disturbing of all, the ability to empathize with others progressively diminishes as people become more successful at treating humans as means rather than ends. Dr. Gabor Mate, who studies addiction and trauma, has argued that our entire economic system is essentially a machine for producing Wendigo-like transformations on a massive scale. The pressure to constantly consume more, achieve more, and compete more intensely creates chronic stress conditions that can trigger the same psychological breakdowns that Indigenous communities observed centuries ago. What makes this particularly terrifying is the scale at which it's happening. Historical Wendigo cases affected individuals or small groups within isolated communities. Modern conditions are creating similar psychological transformations across entire populations, normalized and systematized to the point where we often don't recognize them as pathological. The corporate executive who destroys thousands of lives through layoffs while focusing obsessively on quarterly profits. The social media influencer who exploits their followers' insecurities to sell products they don't need. The political leader who dehumanizes entire populations to maintain power. These aren't isolated cases of individual moral failure. They're systematic manifestations of the same psychological mechanisms that once created literal cannibals in the frozen forests of North America. And just like the historical Wendigo, the condition appears to be contagious. Exposure to environments where humans are routinely dehumanized and exploited can trigger similar transformations in others. The breakdown of one person's moral boundaries makes it easier for those around them to cross similar lines, creating cascading effects that can corrupt entire institutions and communities. This understanding reframes many of the crises facing our modern world. The epidemic of loneliness and social isolation, the rise of political extremism and dehumanizing rhetoric, the increasing normalization of predatory behavior in business, entertainment, and politics. These aren't separate phenomena. They're all manifestations of the same underlying psychological mechanisms that Indigenous communities recognized as the Wendigo transformation. But recognizing the problem also points toward potential solutions. Indigenous communities didn't just identify and fear the Wendigo, they developed sophisticated strategies for preventing and treating the condition. Their approaches were based on maintaining strong community bonds, preserving cultural traditions that reinforced human dignity and interconnection, and intervening early when individuals showed signs of psychological breakdown. Modern research supports the effectiveness of these traditional approaches. Studies consistently show that strong social connections, meaningful cultural participation, and early intervention for trauma and isolation can prevent many forms of psychological breakdown and antisocial behavior. The same community-based strategies that once protected against Wendigo transformations could potentially address many of the psychological epidemics plaguing our modern world. Dr. Johan Hari, who has studied the connection between social isolation and various forms of psychological pathology, argues that the solution to many modern mental health crises lies not in individual treatment, but in rebuilding the community connections and cultural meaning systems that have been eroded by modern life. His research suggests that humans are fundamentally social beings, and that isolation from meaningful community inevitably leads to various forms of psychological breakdown. This brings us back to the fundamental wisdom embedded in the Wendigo stories. They weren't just warnings about the dangers of cannibalism or starvation. They were sophisticated analyses of what happens when humans become disconnected from their communities, their cultural values, and their basic humanity. They were maps of psychological territory that we ignore at our own peril. The indigenous communities that created these stories understood something that we're only beginning to rediscover: that the capacity for monstrous transformation exists within every human being, waiting to be triggered by the right combination of circumstances. But they also understood that this transformation isn't inevitable. It can be prevented through strong community bonds, cultural practices that reinforce human dignity and connection, and early intervention when individuals begin showing signs of psychological breakdown. The question facing us now is whether we're willing to learn from this ancient wisdom, or whether we'll continue creating conditions that systematically transform humans into monsters while pretending not to notice what we're doing. Because make no mistake, the Wendigo is still with us. It has simply learned to wear different faces, to hunt in different territories, and to consume different forms of human flesh and spirit. The frozen forests of North America may seem far removed from our modern urban environments, but the psychological terrain they mapped remains remarkably relevant. The same hungers that once drove desperate people to cannibalism now drive them to consume each other in subtler but equally destructive ways. The same isolation that once left individuals vulnerable to psychological breakdown now affects millions of people trapped in digital bubbles and atomized communities. And just as the original Wendigo could spread from person to person through psychological contagion, the modern versions of this transformation are spreading through our interconnected world at unprecedented speed and scale. We're witnessing the emergence of entire cultures built around the systematic dehumanization and consumption of human beings, normalized to the point where we often mistake them for progress or success. The indigenous peoples who first told these stories would recognize what we're becoming. They would see the signs they spent thousands of years learning to identify: the insatiable hungers, the breakdown of community bonds, the progressive loss of empathy and human connection. They would understand that we're living through a Wendigo epidemic of unprecedented proportions, one that threatens not just individuals or communities, but the entire fabric of human civilization. But they would also know that it's not too late, that the same wisdom that once protected their communities from transformation could still protect ours, that the choice between humanity and monstrosity is one we make every day, in every interaction, in every decision about how we treat ourselves and others. The Wendigo waits in the shadows of our modern world, patient and hungry, feeding on our isolation and our desperation. But it can only consume what we choose to feed it. And that choice, terrifying and hopeful in equal measure, remains entirely our own. The recognition of our modern Wendigo epidemic brings us to a crucial crossroads in understanding this ancient terror. Because once we see the patterns, once we recognize the psychological mechanisms at work, we can no longer pretend that these transformations are random or inevitable. They follow predictable pathways that indigenous communities mapped with extraordinary precision over thousands of years of careful observation. What emerges from the historical record is a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that rivals anything produced by modern science. The Algonquian peoples didn't just fear the Wendigo, they developed detailed taxonomies of the warning signs, the progression stages, and the intervention points where transformation could still be prevented or reversed. The earliest stage, which they called the hunger sickness, was characterized by a growing obsession with consumption, accompanied by increasing social withdrawal. Individuals would begin to hoard food, speak constantly about their appetite, and show diminishing interest in normal social activities. Crucially, this stage was still considered treatable through community intervention and spiritual healing practices. Dr. Jennifer Reed, an anthropologist who has studied traditional healing practices among Great Lakes tribes, documented elaborate ceremonies designed specifically to address early-stage Wendigo symptoms. These rituals weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated therapeutic interventions that addressed both the psychological and social dimensions of the developing condition. The ceremonies typically involved the entire community and focused on reintegrating the affected individual into the social fabric through shared storytelling, communal meals, and ritual activities that reinforced human connections and cultural values. What's remarkable is how closely these traditional treatments mirror modern evidence-based approaches to treating severe psychological disorders. Contemporary therapeutic methods like dialectical behavior therapy and community-based treatment programs use virtually identical strategies, rebuilding social connections, reinforcing cultural meaning systems, and providing alternative outlets for obsessive thoughts and behaviors. The indigenous communities of North America had developed these approaches centuries before Western psychology even existed as a discipline. But they also understood something that modern treatment often misses: the contagious nature of psychological transformation. Their intervention protocols always included measures to protect the broader community from psychological infection, ensuring that one person's breakdown didn't trigger similar breakdowns in others. This community-focused approach becomes even more relevant when we consider how modern Wendigo transformations spread through social networks and digital platforms. The same mechanisms that once carried psychological contagion through isolated winter camps now operate at global scale through our interconnected communication systems. Consider how quickly toxic behaviors can spread through online communities. A single individual engaging in extreme harassment or dehumanizing rhetoric can trigger similar behaviors in dozens or hundreds of others within days or hours. The psychological mechanisms are identical to historical accounts of Wendigo contagion, but the speed and scale of transmission have been amplified exponentially by modern technology. Dr. Nicholas Christakis, who studies social network effects on behavior, has documented how various forms of antisocial behavior can spread through communities following patterns that mirror epidemic disease transmission. His research reveals that exposure to dehumanizing behavior makes individuals significantly more likely to engage in similar behavior themselves, creating cascading effects that can transform entire social environments. This understanding helps explain why certain online platforms become breeding grounds for increasingly extreme and predatory behavior. The algorithmic systems that govern these spaces often create feedback loops that reward and amplify the most engaging content, which tends to be content that triggers strong emotional reactions. Over time, this creates selective pressure that favors increasingly extreme and dehumanizing forms of communication. Users who spend significant time in these environments report psychological changes that mirror historical Wendigo accounts. They describe becoming addicted to the rush of causing emotional reactions in others, losing empathy for people they disagree with, and viewing other humans primarily as sources of content or targets for manipulation. The progression follows the same pattern: initial boundary crossing, followed by psychological changes that make the behavior compulsive, leading to complete breakdown of normal moral functioning. But the digital realm represents just one vector for modern Wendigo transmission. The same psychological mechanisms operate in corporate environments, political movements, and social institutions, where humans are systematically reduced to their instrumental value and treated as resources to be consumed. Take the phenomenon that business researchers call toxic leadership. Studies of corporate environments where leaders engage in systematic employee exploitation reveal remarkably consistent patterns. The behavior typically begins with relatively minor boundary violations justified by business necessity. But over time, these leaders report experiencing what they describe as an addictive rush from exercising power over others. The progression invariably follows the Wendigo pattern. Initial violations lead to psychological changes that make further violations easier and more rewarding. The leader's ability to empathize with employees progressively diminishes while their appetite for control and dominance grows stronger. Eventually, they reach a point where they view their workforce purely as resources to be consumed, with no regard for their humanity or welfare. Dr. Robert Hare, who developed the standard assessment tool for psychopathy, has noted that many corporate leaders who engage in systematic employee abuse show brain scan patterns virtually identical to those found in violentopaths, who criminals. But unlike psych are often born with abnormal brain structure, these individuals show clear evidence of acquired changes that occurred after they began engaging in predatory behavior. This suggests that the corporate environment itself can trigger Wendigo-like transformations in individuals who might otherwise maintain normal moral functioning. The same isolation from consequences, the same pressure to view humans as instrumental resources, and the same reward systems that reinforce predatory behavior create conditions remarkably similar to those that historically produced literal cannibals. The contagious aspect becomes apparent when we examine how toxic leadership spreads through organizational hierarchies. Employees who work under abusive leaders often begin adopting similar behaviors toward their own subordinates, creating cascading effects that can corrupt entire institutions. The psychological mechanisms are identical to those observed in historical Wendigo outbreaks. Exposure to dehumanizing behavior triggers similar transformations in others. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of modern Wendigo phenomena is how they've become normalized and even celebrated in many contexts. Behaviors that would have been immediately recognized as pathological by Indigenous communities are now often praised as evidence of strength, success, or competitive advantage. The entrepreneur who destroys their health and relationships in pursuit of business success, the social media personality who exploits their audience's insecurities for profit, the political leader who dehumanizes opponents to maintain power. These individuals are often held up as role models, their Wendigo-like transformations reframed as admirable dedication or strategic thinking. This normalization makes the condition far more dangerous than its historical manifestations. When communities recognize pathological behavior as pathological, they can implement interventions and protective measures. But when the same behaviors are celebrated and rewarded, they spread unchecked through social networks, creating epidemic conditions that can transform entire cultures. Dr. Christopher Lasch, in his analysis of narcissistic personality disorders in modern society, argued that we've created cultural conditions that systematically reward Wendigo-like transformations while punishing the community-oriented behaviors that historically protected against them. The result is what he called a culture of narcissism, where pathological self-absorption and exploitation of others become normalized survival strategies. This cultural shift helps explain why modern Wendigo transformations often go unrecognized, even by the individuals experiencing them. Historical cases typically involved people who retained enough moral awareness to recognize their condition as pathological and beg for help or intervention. Modern cases often involve individuals who have been so thoroughly convinced that their predatory behavior is normal or even virtuous that they lack the self-awareness to recognize their own transformation. The tech executive who boasts about their ability to manipulate user behavior for profit. The influencer who celebrates their skill at exploiting followers' psychological vulnerabilities. The politician who takes pride in their effectiveness at dehumanizing opponents. These individuals often exhibit all the classic signs of Wendigo transformation while genuinely believing they're demonstrating admirable qualities. This lack of self-awareness makes modern cases far more resistant to traditional intervention strategies. Historical Wendigo victims could often be reached through appeals to their remaining humanity or through community pressure that help them recognize the pathological nature of their condition. Modern victims are often surrounded by social environments that reinforce their transformed state and provide ideological frameworks that justify their behavior. The result is what researchers call moral disengagement, a psychological process where individuals learn to deactivate their normal ethical standards without experiencing guilt or shame. They develop sophisticated justification systems that allow them to engage in increasingly predatory behavior while maintaining a positive self-image. Dr. Albert Bandura, who first identified moral disengagement mechanisms, has documented how these processes can spread through organizations and communities, creating environments where systematic dehumanization becomes not just accepted, but actively promoted. The same psychological mechanisms that once allowed individual Wendigos to justify cannibalism now allow entire institutions to justify treating humans as expendable resources. But recognizing these patterns also reveals potential intervention points. If modern Wendigo transformations follow predictable pathways and spread through identifiable mechanisms, then we can potentially develop strategies to prevent or reverse them based on the wisdom embedded in traditional Indigenous practices. The key insight from historical accounts is that prevention is far more effective than treatment once transformation has progressed beyond the early stages. Indigenous communities invested enormous energy in maintaining social conditions that prevented Wendigo transformations from occurring in the first place, rather than trying to cure them after they had developed. Their approach focused on three primary prevention strategies: maintaining strong community bonds that provided emotional and practical support during difficult times, preserving cultural practices that reinforced human dignity and interconnection, and developing early warning systems that could identify individuals at risk before transformation began. Modern research supports the effectiveness of all three approaches. Studies consistently show that strong social connections are among the most powerful predictors of psychological resilience and moral behavior. People embedded in supportive communities are far less likely to develop various forms of antisocial behavior, even when exposed to extreme stress or trauma. Cultural practices that regularly affirm human dignity and promote empathetic connection also show powerful protective effects. Religious communities, volunteer organizations, and other groups that engage in regular collective activities focused on helping others show significantly lower rates of various psychological pathologies, including those associated with predatory or exploitative behavior. Early intervention systems based on recognizing warning signs before full transformation occurs have also proven highly effective in modern contexts. Programs that identify and support individuals showing early signs of social isolation, moral disengagement, or obsessive consumption behaviors can prevent progression to more severe forms of pathological behavior. Dr. James Gilligan, who has spent decades studying the roots of violence and antisocial behavior, argues that most extreme pathological behaviors can be prevented through early intervention that addresses the underlying conditions of shame, isolation, and meaninglessness that typically precede transformation. His work with violent offenders has shown that even individuals who have engaged in extreme predatory behavior can often be reached through therapeutic approaches that rebuild their capacity for empathy and human connection. But the challenge we face is implementing these prevention strategies at sufficient scale to address the epidemic proportions of modern Wendigo transformations. The same technological and social systems that amplify the spread of pathological behaviors could potentially be redesigned to promote psychological health and community connection instead. Consider how social media platforms could be restructured to reward empathetic communication and community building, rather than engagement-driven content that often promotes division and dehumanization. The same algorithmic systems that currently create feedback loops favoring extreme content could be recalibrated to promote behaviors that strengthen rather than weaken social bonds. Corporate environments could be redesigned to reward collaborative and sustainable practices, rather than short-term exploitation of human and environmental resources. The same performance metrics that currently incentivize predatory behavior could be restructured to measure long-term value creation and stakeholder well-being. Political systems could be reformed to promote constructive dialogue and problem-solving rather than the zero-sum competition that currently rewards dehumanization of opponents. The same institutional structures that currently amplify divisive rhetoric could be modified to incentivize bridge building and collaborative governance. But implementing these changes requires first acknowledging that we're facing a genuine epidemic of psychological transformation, not just isolated cases of individual moral failure. It requires recognizing that the same conditions that once created literal cannibals in isolated winter camps are now creating metaphorical cannibals in boardrooms, online platforms, and political arenas across the globe. The indigenous communities that first identified the Wendigo understood that some transformations, once completed, were irreversible. They knew that prevention was not just preferable to treatment, it was often the only realistic option. Individuals who had fully crossed the psychological threshold into Wendigo consciousness could rarely be brought back to normal human functioning. This understanding carries sobering implications for our modern context. If we continue creating conditions that systematically trigger Wendigo transformations while failing to implement adequate prevention strategies, we may reach a tipping point where the psychological infection becomes so widespread that it fundamentally alters the character of human civilization itself. But the same wisdom that warns us about this danger also points toward hope. Indigenous communities successfully maintained their humanity for thousands of years in environments that were often far more challenging than anything most of us face today. They developed and preserved cultural technologies for preventing psychological breakdown and maintaining community cohesion that remain as relevant now as they were centuries ago. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn from their example before it's too late. Whether we can recognize the Wendigo transformations occurring all around us and implement the community-based prevention strategies that might still save us from becoming the monsters we fear. Because in the end, that's what the Wendigo stories were always really about. Not supernatural creatures lurking in distant forests, but the very real possibility that humans can lose their humanity when pushed beyond their breaking point or seduced by systems that reward predatory behavior. They were warnings about what we could become, and guidance about how to remain human, even in the face of circumstances that seem designed to strip away our humanity. The ancient terror that stalked the frozen forests of North America has never really left us. It has simply adapted to new environments and learned to hunt in new ways. But so too has the ancient wisdom that once protected communities from its influence. The choice between transformation and preservation, between becoming monsters or remaining human, is one that each generation must make for itself. And that choice, as terrifying and crucial as ever, now rests with us. The stories our ancestors told around flickering fires weren't just entertainment. They were survival manuals disguised as folklore, psychological maps of territories too dangerous to explore without guidance. And nowhere is this more evident than in the terrifying consistency of Wendigo accounts across vast geographical and cultural distances. What makes the Wendigo phenomenon truly chilling isn't its supernatural elements, but how precisely it describes real psychological processes that modern science is only beginning to understand. When we strip away the mythological language and examine the core mechanisms, we find descriptions of trauma responses, neurological changes, and behavioral transformations that align remarkably well with contemporary research into extreme psychological breakdown. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, whose groundbreaking work on trauma has revolutionized our understanding of how extreme experiences reshape the human brain, has identified patterns in severe trauma cases that mirror almost exactly what Indigenous communities observed in Wendigo transformations. Individuals who have experienced overwhelming psychological stress show measurable changes in brain structure, particularly in areas responsible for empathy, impulse control, and social bonding. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes hyperactive and enlarged. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making and moral reasoning, shows decreased activity and sometimes actual tissue damage. Most disturbing of all, the areas of the brain that normally activate when we see other humans in distress. Our neurological capacity for empathy can become permanently impaired. These aren't temporary changes that heal with time. They represent fundamental alterations in how the brain processes reality, relationships, and moral decision-making. The person doesn't just act differently, they literally become neurologically different in ways that affect every aspect of their functioning. When we apply this understanding to historical Wendigo accounts, a disturbing picture emerges. The gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance consistently described in transformation accounts aligns perfectly with what we now know about the physical effects of chronic stress and malnutrition on the human body. But the behavioral changes, the loss of empathy, the obsessive focus on consumption, these point to something far more complex than simple starvation. We're looking at descriptions of complete neurological reorganization triggered by extreme trauma and taboo violation. The individual doesn't just become hungry or desperate, they become fundamentally altered at the level of brain structure and function. Their capacity for normal human emotion, relationship, and moral reasoning becomes compromised in ways that make their behavior increasingly predatory and compulsive. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. Recent research into epigenetic trauma has revealed that these neurological changes can be passed down to future generations through alterations in gene expression. The psychological damage inflicted by Wendigo transformation doesn't just affect the individual, it can affect their children and grandchildren, creating cycles of dysfunction that can persist for generations. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's studies of Holocaust survivors and their descendants have shown that extreme trauma can literally rewrite genetic code in ways that are inherited by offspring. Children and grandchildren of trauma survivors show altered stress responses, increased vulnerability to psychological breakdown, and in some cases, structural brain differences that mirror those found in their traumatized ancestors. This means that historical Wendigo cases may have created psychological vulnerabilities that are still affecting descendant populations today. The trauma inflicted by witnessing or experiencing cannibalistic transformation could have left genetic markers that make subsequent generations more susceptible to similar psychological breakdowns under stress. When we examine modern Indigenous communities that have historical connections to areas where Wendigo cases occurred, we do indeed find elevated rates of various psychological disorders, including depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. While these problems are often attributed to the ongoing effects of colonization and cultural disruption, the possibility that some vulnerability stems from ancestral trauma related to Wendigo phenomena adds another layer of complexity to understanding these communities' psychological challenges. But the implications extend far beyond Indigenous populations. If Wendigo-type transformations can create heritable psychological vulnerabilities, then the epidemic of modern psychological cannibalism we've been documenting may be creating similar genetic legacies that will affect future generations in ways we're only beginning to understand. Consider the children of individuals who have undergone modern Wendigo transformations, the offspring of corporate executives who have lost the capacity for empathy, the descendants of political leaders who have learned to dehumanize entire populations, the children of individuals who have become addicted to digital platforms that reward predatory behavior toward others. These children are being raised in environments where normal human empathy and moral reasoning are systematically undermined. They're witnessing daily examples of humans being treated as resources to be consumed rather than individuals worthy of respect and dignity. They're learning that success requires the ability to exploit others without experiencing guilt or remorse. The neurological and genetic implications are staggering. We may be creating entire generations of individuals who are biologically predisposed to the same psychological transformations that are affecting their parents. The Wendigo epidemic isn't just consuming the current generation, it's programming future generations to be more susceptible to similar consumption. Dr. Bruce Perry, who studies childhood trauma and its long-term effects, has documented how children who grow up in environments characterized by chronic stress, emotional neglect, and exposure to predatory behavior show measurable differences in brain development. Their stress response systems become permanently altered, their capacity for forming healthy relationships is impaired, and their moral reasoning abilities are compromised. These children don't just learn different behaviors, they develop different neurological architectures that make certain types of antisocial behavior more likely and more rewarding. They become, in essence, biologically prepared for Wendigo-type transformations should they encounter the right triggering conditions as adults. But the generational transmission of Wendigo vulnerability extends beyond direct biological inheritance. Cultural transmission plays an equally important role in perpetuating the psychological patterns that create susceptibility to transformation. Children who grow up in families or communities where humans are routinely dehumanized learn that this is normal human behavior. They internalize belief systems that make predatory behavior seem not just acceptable but necessary for survival. They develop worldviews where empathy is seen as weakness and exploitation of others is viewed as evidence of strength or intelligence. These cultural patterns can persist for generations even without direct biological transmission. Communities that have experienced historical trauma often develop what researchers call cultural trauma responses that shape how subsequent generations understand reality, relationships, and moral behavior. Dr. Jeffrey Alexander, who studies collective trauma and its transmission, has documented how traumatic events can become embedded in cultural narratives in ways that influence behavior for centuries after the original trauma occurred. The stories communities tell about their past, the values they emphasize, and the behaviors they reward all carry forward the psychological impact of historical trauma. In the case of communities that experienced historical Wendigo phenomena, this cultural transmission may take the form of heightened suspicion of others, emphasis on individual survival over community cooperation, or normalization of behaviors that would have been recognized as pathological in healthier cultural contexts. But cultural transmission can also carry forward protective factors. Indigenous communities that successfully resisted or recovered from Wendigo outbreaks often developed particularly strong cultural practices focused on maintaining human dignity, preventing social isolation, and intervening early when individuals showed signs of psychological distress. These protective cultural elements represent some of the most valuable resources we have for understanding how to prevent modern Wendigo transformations. They are time-tested technologies for maintaining community mental health that were refined over thousands of years of dealing with extreme psychological challenges. The Haudenosaunee, for example, developed elaborate consensus-building processes that ensured every community member had a voice in important decisions. Their governance structures were designed to prevent the concentration of power that can enable predatory behavior, while ensuring that no individual became so isolated that they were vulnerable to psychological breakdown. The Anishinaabe created storytelling traditions that regularly reinforce the interconnectedness of all life and the importance of maintaining balance between individual needs and community welfare. Their ceremonies and seasonal celebrations provided regular opportunities for community members to reconnect with each other and with cultural values that emphasized human dignity and mutual responsibility. These weren't just quaint cultural practices. They were sophisticated social technologies designed to prevent exactly the kinds of psychological transformations we're now witnessing on a global scale. They created social environments where Wendigo-type behavior was not just discouraged, but made psychologically difficult to develop and maintain. The challenge we face is adapting these traditional protective technologies to modern contexts where the scale and speed of social interaction has been fundamentally transformed by technology and globalization. The same digital platforms that can spread psychological contagion at unprecedented speed could potentially be redesigned to promote the kinds of human connection and cultural reinforcement that historically protected against Wendigo transformations. Imagine social media platforms designed around Indigenous principles of community building and mutual support, rather than engagement maximization and attention harvesting. Consider corporate structures based on traditional models of collective decision-making and shared responsibility rather than hierarchical exploitation. Envision political systems that incorporate Indigenous wisdom about preventing the concentration of power and maintaining accountability to community welfare. These aren't utopian fantasies. They're practical applications of psychological and social technologies that were successfully used for thousands of years to maintain human communities in the face of extreme challenges. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn from these examples before our modern Wendigo epidemic reaches the point of no return. Because make no mistake, we are approaching critical thresholds. The normalization of predatory behavior in business, politics, and social interaction has reached levels that would have triggered immediate intervention in traditional Indigenous communities. The isolation and atomization of modern life has created conditions of psychological vulnerability that historically preceded Wendigo outbreaks. Most concerning of all, the contagious spread of dehumanizing behavior through digital networks is happening at a pace and scale that overwhelms traditional community-based intervention strategies. We're witnessing psychological transformations occurring faster than our social systems can adapt to contain them. The result is what some researchers are calling a cascade failure of social cohesion. As more individuals undergo Wendigo-type transformations, they create conditions that make similar transformations more likely in others. The psychological infection spreads exponentially until it reaches a tipping point where predatory behavior becomes the dominant social pattern rather than an aberrant exception. Dr. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who studies complex systems and their failure modes, has identified similar patterns in financial markets, ecological systems, and social organizations. Once a system reaches a certain threshold of internal dysfunction, it can undergo rapid and irreversible collapse that transforms its entire character. Applied to our current situation, this suggests that we may have a limited window of opportunity to implement preventive interventions before modern Wendigo transformations reach epidemic proportions that fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. The same exponential dynamics that are driving the spread of psychological pathology could potentially be harnessed to spread psychological health if we can identify and implement the right intervention strategies. But this requires acknowledging that we're facing a genuine crisis of human psychological development, not just isolated cases of individual moral failure. It requires recognizing that the same environmental and social conditions that historically created literal cannibals are now creating metaphorical cannibals who consume human dignity, community cohesion, and cultural meaning. Most importantly, it requires understanding that the solutions exist. Indigenous communities successfully prevented and treated Wendigo transformations for thousands of years, using approaches that remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. The challenge isn't developing new interventions, it's implementing traditional wisdom at the scale and speed required to address modern conditions. The path forward becomes clearer when we examine communities that have successfully resisted modern Wendigo transformations despite being exposed to the same conditions that have triggered psychological breakdown in other populations. These communities share certain characteristics that mirror the protective factors identified in traditional Indigenous practices. They maintain strong social bonds that provide emotional and practical support during difficult times. They preserve cultural practices that regularly reinforce human dignity and interconnection. They have developed systems for identifying and supporting individuals who show early signs of psychological distress before transformation progresses to irreversible stages. Most importantly, they understand that preventing psychological breakdown requires ongoing community effort rather than individual treatment after problems have already developed. They invest in creating and maintaining social environments that naturally promote psychological health. rather than trying to fix individuals after they've been damaged by toxic social conditions. These communities demonstrate that it's still possible to maintain human psychological health even in modern contexts characterized by rapid change, technological disruption, and social fragmentation. But they also reveal how much intentional effort is required to create and maintain protective social environments in a world where the default conditions increasingly promote psychological breakdown. The ancient wisdom embedded in Wendigo stories provides a roadmap for this effort. It tells us what warning signs to watch for, what conditions to avoid, and what protective factors to cultivate. Most importantly, it reminds us that the choice between transformation and preservation is one that communities must make collectively rather than leaving to individual willpower or moral strength. The Wendigo represents the shadow side of human potential, the capacity for monstrous transformation that exists within all of us. But it also represents the wisdom of communities that learn to recognize and prevent such transformations through thousands of years of careful observation and cultural innovation. That wisdom remains available to us, encoded in stories and practices that have survived centuries of cultural disruption and change. The question is whether we're ready to learn from it before the ancient terror completes its adaptation to our modern world and begins consuming what remains of our humanity. The choice, as it has always been, is ours to make. But the window for making it may be closing faster than we realize. The Wendigo has been patient for centuries, feeding on human isolation and desperation in whatever form it takes. It won't wait much longer for us to decide whether we want to remain human or join the growing ranks of those who have chosen a different path. In the deepest part of the forest, where the old stories say the trees themselves hold memory, something waits with infinite patience. It has watched civilizations rise and fall, seen humans create wonders and commit horrors beyond imagination. It has learned that the most effective way to consume humanity is not through force, but through seduction. By making the transformation seem like evolution, the consumption seem like success, the loss of empathy seem like strength, and it is winning. The statistics are more terrifying than any folklore could ever be. In the past 50 years, rates of social isolation have tripled across developed nations. Empathy scores among college students have dropped by 40% since the 1980s. Corporate executives now score higher on psychopathy assessments than prison inmates. These aren't just numbers on a page. They're measurements of a transformation so gradual, so normalized, that we've mistaken it for progress. Dr. Sarah Conrath, who has spent decades tracking empathy levels in American populations, describes what she calls the Great Disconnection. Her research reveals patterns that would have been immediately recognizable to Indigenous communities as early-stage Wendigo symptoms. Young people report feeling increasingly unable to connect with others' emotional experiences, describing other humans in increasingly transactional terms, and showing diminishing concern for the welfare of people outside their immediate social circles. But what makes her findings particularly chilling is the speed of change. The empathy decline isn't gradual, it's accelerating. Each new generation shows steeper drops in emotional connection than the previous one, suggesting that we're witnessing a cascade effect where each cohort becomes more isolated and predatory than the last. The neurological evidence supports this terrifying trajectory. Brain imaging studies of young adults who have grown up immersed in digital environments show structural differences in areas responsible for emotional processing and social connection. The regions that normally activate when we see others in distress are measurably smaller and less active than in previous generations. Dr. Michael Posner, whose research into brain plasticity has revealed how environmental factors shape neural development, argues that we're witnessing the emergence of what he calls post-empathic cognition. The constant exposure to digital environments where humans are reduced to profiles, metrics, and engagement targets is literally rewiring developing brains to process other people as objects rather than subjects. These changes aren't reversible through simple digital detoxes or mindfulness exercises. They represent fundamental alterations in neural architecture that affect how individuals process reality, relationships, and moral decision-making throughout their lives. We're creating generations of humans who are neurologically prepared for Wendigo transformations because their brains have been shaped by environments that systematically undermine the capacity for genuine human connection. The implications become even more disturbing when we examine how these neurological changes interact with modern economic and social systems. Environments that reward predatory behavior toward others naturally select for individuals who lack normal empathetic responses. Over time, this creates what evolutionary biologists call selection pressure that favors psychologically transformed individuals while punishing those who maintain normal human emotional connections. Consider the modern corporate environment, where success increasingly requires the ability to make decisions that harm thousands of people while maintaining focus on abstract metrics like quarterly profits and shareholder value. Individuals who experience normal emotional responses to human suffering are at a disadvantage in such environments, while those who can treat human welfare as irrelevant data points are rewarded with promotions, wealth, and social status. The same pattern emerges in political systems, where electoral success depends on the ability to dehumanize opponents and mobilize tribal hatred. Candidates who maintain empathetic connection to all constituents are consistently outperformed by those who can systematically exploit fear, anger, and tribal loyalty without experiencing the emotional cost of their actions. Even social media platforms reward content creators who can manipulate their audience's psychological vulnerabilities without concern for the human cost. The algorithms that determine which content gets amplified naturally favor material that generates strong emotional reactions, creating selective pressure that rewards increasingly predatory forms of psychological manipulation. The result is what researchers call psychopathic selection, where social systems systematically promote individuals who display Wendigo-like characteristics while marginalizing those who maintain normal human empathy and moral reasoning. Over time, this creates institutional environments dominated by psychologically transformed individuals who normalize and amplify predatory behaviors. Dr. Robert Hare's research into corporate psychopathy has revealed that senior leadership positions in major corporations are now disproportionately occupied by individuals who score in the clinical range for psychopathic traits. These aren't people who are born with abnormal brain structure, but individuals who have undergone psychological transformations that mirror historical Wendigo accounts. The progression follows the familiar pattern: initial boundary violations, justified by business necessity or competitive pressure. Gradual escalation as the behavior becomes more rewarding and less emotionally costly. Progressive loss of empathy as the neurological capacity for emotional connection atrophies through disuse. Eventually, complete transformation into something that views other humans purely as resources to be exploited. But unlike historical Wendigo cases, these modern transformations are celebrated rather than treated as pathological. The corporate executive who destroys thousands of jobs to increase profits is praised for making tough decisions. The political leader who dehumanizes opponents is admired for their strategic effectiveness. The social media personality who exploits their audience's insecurities is celebrated for their marketing genius. This normalization makes modern Wendigo transformations far more dangerous than their historical counterparts. When communities recognize pathological behavior as pathological, they can implement protective measures. But when the same behaviors are rewarded and institutionalized, they spread unchecked through social networks, creating epidemic conditions that can transform entire cultures. The contagious aspect operates through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. Direct modeling, where individuals learn predatory behaviors by observing successful practitioners. Institutional pressure, where organizational structures reward Wendigo-like traits while punishing empathetic responses. Cultural transmission, where transformed individuals reshape social norms to justify and normalize their behavior. The speed of contagion has been accelerated exponentially by digital communication systems that allow transformed individuals to influence thousands or millions of others simultaneously. A single corporate leader who has undergone Wendigo transformation can create policies that force similar transformations in subordinates across global organizations. A political figure who has lost empathetic connection can mobilize millions of followers to adopt similar dehumanizing attitudes toward targeted populations. Most insidiously, digital platforms can spread Wendigo psychology through algorithmic amplification of content that rewards predatory behavior. Users who engage with dehumanizing material are systematically exposed to more extreme content, creating gradual desensitization that mirrors the progression observed in historical transformation accounts. The scale and speed of modern contagion overwhelms traditional community-based intervention strategies. Indigenous communities could identify and isolate individuals showing early transformation symptoms before they affected others. Modern, transformed individuals can influence global audiences before their condition is even recognized as pathological. Dr. Sherry Turkle's research into digital communication and its psychological effects has revealed how online environments create what she calls technological self, that operates according to different moral and emotional rules than face-to-face interaction. The distance and anonymity provided by digital platforms removes many of the social constraints that normally inhibit predatory behavior, creating conditions where moral boundaries can dissolve rapidly. But the most disturbing aspect of modern Wendigo contagion is how it exploits our evolved social learning mechanisms. Humans are biologically programmed to learn behaviors from high-status individuals in their social environment. When successful, wealthy, or powerful people display predatory characteristics, others naturally begin modeling similar behaviors as adaptive strategies for achieving similar success. This creates what researchers call moral cascade failure, where the breakdown of ethical behavior in leadership positions triggers similar breakdowns throughout social hierarchies. The psychological mechanisms that once helped human communities survive by learning from successful group members now spread pathological behaviors that undermine the social cooperation these mechanisms were designed to support. The epidemic proportions become clear when we examine aggregated data across multiple social domains. Corporate malfeasance has increased exponentially over the past 50 years, with financial fraud, environmental destruction, and worker exploitation reaching levels that would have been unthinkable in previous generations. Political discourse has devolved into systematic dehumanization, where opponents are regularly described in terms that historically preceded genocide and ethnic cleansing. Even interpersonal relationships show evidence of increasing predation and exploitation. Dating apps that gamify human connection have created environments where other people are treated as disposable entertainment. Social media platforms reward users for exploiting others' vulnerabilities for engagement. Consumer culture promotes relationships based on what others can provide, rather than genuine human connection and mutual support. The cumulative effect is a social environment where predatory behavior toward other humans has become so normalized that many people no longer recognize it as pathological. We've created conditions where Wendigo transformations can occur without triggering the community alarm systems that historically protected against such psychological breakdown. But recognition of the problem also points toward potential solutions. The same social learning mechanisms that spread pathological behaviors can potentially be harnessed to spread psychological health if we can identify and promote individuals who model empathetic, community-oriented behaviors. Indigenous communities understood this principle and structured their societies to ensure that leadership positions were occupied by individuals who demonstrated exceptional capacity for empathy, wisdom, and service to community welfare. They developed elaborate selection processes that identified and eliminated individuals showing early signs of predatory tendencies, while promoting those who showed exceptional capacity for maintaining community cohesion and mutual support. Modern research supports the effectiveness of these traditional approaches. Studies consistently show that organizations led by individuals with high empathy scores show better long-term performance, higher employee satisfaction, and more sustainable practices than those led by individuals with psychopathic traits. Communities that prioritize empathetic leadership show lower rates of various social pathologies and higher levels of overall well-being. The challenge is implementing these principles at sufficient scale to counter the epidemic spread of Wendigo transformations. This requires fundamental changes in how we structure economic systems, political institutions, and social organizations to reward empathetic behavior while preventing the concentration of power in the hands of psychologically transformed individuals. Some communities and organizations have begun implementing such changes with promising results. Benefit corporations that prioritize social and environmental impact alongside profits show different behavioral patterns than traditional profit-maximizing entities. Political systems that incorporate deliberative democracy and citizen participation show less polarization and dehumanization than those dominated by professional political classes. Social media platforms designed around community building and mutual support rather than engagement maximization create different behavioral incentives than those focused purely on capturing and monetizing attention. Educational systems that prioritize emotional intelligence and empathetic communication produce graduates with different psychological profiles than those focused solely on competitive achievement. These examples demonstrate that alternative approaches are possible, but they also reveal how much intentional effort is required to create social environments that promote psychological health rather than pathology. The default conditions of modern life increasingly favor Wendigo transformations, making it necessary to actively design systems that support empathetic human connection. The path forward requires acknowledging that we're facing a genuine epidemic of psychological transformation, not just isolated cases of individual moral failure. It requires understanding that the conditions creating modern Wendigo transformations are systematic rather than accidental, and that addressing them requires coordinated intervention across multiple social domains simultaneously. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that the solutions exist in the accumulated wisdom of communities that successfully prevented such transformations for thousands of years. Indigenous practices for maintaining empathetic connection, preventing dangerous concentration of power, and intervening early when individuals show signs of psychological breakdown remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. The question is whether we can implement these traditional technologies for maintaining community mental health at the scale and speed required to address modern conditions. The same digital systems that currently spread psychological pathology could potentially be redesigned to promote empathetic connection and community cohesion. The same economic structures that currently reward predatory behavior could be modified to incentivize cooperation and mutual support. But such changes require collective action by communities that understand the stakes involved. Individual efforts to maintain empathetic connection are insufficient when surrounded by social systems that systematically undermine such connections. What's needed is coordinated transformation of the environmental conditions that currently promote Wendigo psychology. The ancient stories provide both warning and guidance for this effort. They tell us what we risk becoming if we fail to act, but they also show us what we can remain if we choose wisely. The Wendigo represents the shadow of human potential, but the communities that created these stories also represent the light. They show us what's possible when humans commit to maintaining their humanity, even in the face of circumstances designed to strip it away. The choice between transformation and preservation remains before us, but the window for making it may be narrowing. The exponential dynamics that drive epidemic spread work in both directions. Just as pathological behaviors can cascade through social networks, So too can healing behaviors if they reach sufficient critical mass. The question is whether we can mobilize the collective will to choose healing before the transformation becomes irreversible. The Wendigo has shown remarkable patience in its adaptation to modern conditions, but that patience isn't infinite. At some point, the psychological infection will reach levels where intervention becomes impossible and the transformation becomes permanent. We stand at that threshold now, facing the same choice that countless communities have faced throughout history. We can recognize the signs, implement the protective measures, and preserve our humanity. Or we can continue pretending that the transformation isn't happening until we wake up one day to discover we've become the monsters we once feared. The ancient wisdom encoded in the Wendigo stories offers no guarantee of success, but it does provide a clear roadmap for the attempt. It tells us what to watch for, what to avoid, and what to cultivate if we want to remain recognizably human in a world increasingly designed to make us something else. The forest remembers what we've forgotten. The old stories hold truths we've tried to rationalize away. And somewhere in the space between ancient wisdom and modern crisis, the possibility of redemption still flickers like firelight against the gathering darkness. But the fire grows smaller each year, and the darkness grows bolder. Soon we'll discover whether the light of human wisdom is strong enough to hold back the shadow of our own potential for transformation. The Wendigo waits with infinite patience for our answer, knowing that time itself is on its side. In the end, the most terrifying thing about the Wendigo isn't that it exists outside us, hunting us from the depths of dark forests. It's that it exists inside us, waiting for the right conditions to emerge from the civilized facade we've constructed around our deepest hungers. And in our modern world, those conditions are being carefully cultivated by systems that profit from our transformation into something that consumes without conscience, competes without compassion, and succeeds without soul. The question that haunts the edges of our collective consciousness isn't whether the Wendigo is real. The question is whether we still are. The transformation doesn't announce itself with fanfare or dramatic revelation. It creeps forward on silent feet, wearing the mask of progress, adaptation, survival. By the time we recognize what we've become, the neural pathways have already been carved. The empathetic responses have already atrophied. The capacity for genuine human connection has already withered beyond easy repair. But there are still those who remember. Scattered across our fractured world like embers from an ancient fire, communities and individuals who have somehow maintained their humanity despite being surrounded by systems designed to strip it away. They serve as living proof that the transformation isn't inevitable, that another path remains possible even in the darkest corners of our modern wilderness. Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, a botanist and member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, has spent decades documenting what she calls the grammar of animacy, the linguistic and conceptual frameworks that Indigenous communities use to maintain recognition of other beings as subjects rather than objects. Her research reveals how profoundly language shapes our capacity for empathetic connection, and how the systematic objectification embedded in modern discourse creates cognitive conditions that mirror the early stages of Wendigo transformation. In traditional Indigenous languages, she notes, the pronouns used for other living beings are the same as those used for humans. Plants, animals, rivers, and forests are referred to as who, rather than what, as beings with agency and dignity rather than resources to be exploited. This isn't primitive anthropomorphism, but sophisticated psychological technology that maintains neural pathways for recognizing consciousness and value in others. The implications become startling when we consider how modern language systematically trains us to think about other humans. Workers become human resources or personnel. Customers become targets and demographics. Political opponents become problems to be solved or obstacles to be overcome. The linguistic dehumanization that historically preceded genocide and ethnic cleansing has become the standard discourse of business, politics, and social interaction. This verbal transformation of humans into objects creates what researchers call moral disengagement, a psychological process where individuals learn to deactivate their normal ethical responses without experiencing guilt or shame. The language literally rewires our brains to process other people as things, making predatory behavior feel natural and justified. But communities that maintain animistic language patterns show remarkable resistance to Wendigo-type transformations. Their members report higher levels of life satisfaction, stronger social connections, and lower rates of various psychological pathologies. Most importantly, they demonstrate sustained capacity for empathetic response, even under extreme stress conditions that trigger transformation in other populations. The protective effect operates through multiple mechanisms. The language patterns maintain neural pathways for recognizing consciousness in others. The cultural practices that accompany these linguistic frameworks provide regular opportunities for empathetic connection and mutual support. The worldview that emerges from treating all beings as subjects rather than objects creates psychological resilience against the isolation and meaninglessness that typically precede transformation. Dr. Tim Kasser, whose research into materialism and its psychological effects has revealed the connection between consumer culture and various forms of mental distress, has found that communities maintaining traditional relationship-based values show dramatically different patterns of brain activity than those organized around material accumulation and individual achievement. Brain imaging studies reveal that individuals from community-oriented cultures show stronger activation in areas associated with empathy and social connection, while those from materialistic cultures show enhanced activity in regions associated with threat detection and competitive behavior. The differences aren't just cultural preferences. They represent fundamental alterations in neural architecture that affect how individuals process reality and relationships. But what makes Kasser's findings particularly relevant to understanding modern Wendigo phenomena is his discovery that materialistic values create what he calls insatiable appetites that mirror the endless hunger described in traditional transformation accounts. Individuals who adopt consumer-oriented worldviews report feeling chronically dissatisfied regardless of how much they acquire, leading to progressively more extreme behaviors in pursuit of satisfaction that never arrives. The neurological mechanisms are identical to those observed in various forms of addiction. The initial acquisition of material goods or status symbols triggers dopamine release that creates temporary satisfaction, but the brain rapidly adapts to these reward levels, requiring increasingly extreme stimulation to achieve the same psychological payoff. Over time, individuals become trapped in escalating cycles of consumption that progressively distance them from genuine human connection and meaning. The parallels to historical Wendigo accounts are unmistakable. The insatiable hunger that no amount of consumption can satisfy. The progressive isolation from community and family. The increasing willingness to harm others in pursuit of temporary satisfaction. The gradual loss of empathetic response as the obsessive focus on acquisition overwrites normal social emotions. Modern consumer culture has essentially systematized the psychological mechanisms that once created individual Wendigo transformations, scaling them up to affect entire populations while disguising them as normal economic behavior. The same appetites that once drove desperate individuals to cannibalism now drive millions to consume each other's labor, dignity, and natural environment in pursuit of satisfaction that remains perpetually out of reach. But scattered throughout our consumption-obsessed world are communities that have maintained alternative economic models based on principles of reciprocity, sustainability, and mutual aid. These communities demonstrate that different organizational structures can promote psychological health rather than pathology, even within the broader context of systems designed to trigger transformation. The Transition Towns movement, which began in Ireland and has spread to over 1,000 communities worldwide, represents one such alternative approach. These communities explicitly reject the growth-oriented consumption model in favor of what they call relocalization, building local economic systems based on cooperation, sustainability, and human-scale organization. Members of transition communities report psychological profiles that differ dramatically from those found in conventional consumer-oriented populations. They show higher levels of life satisfaction, stronger social connections, and greater resilience in the face of economic and environmental challenges. Most importantly, they demonstrate sustained capacity for empathetic response and community cooperation even under conditions of scarcity that typically trigger competitive and predatory behaviors. The protective effects appear to result from several factors working in combination. The emphasis on local production and consumption creates direct relationships between producers and consumers, maintaining recognition of the human cost of economic activity. The cooperative economic structures distribute power and resources in ways that prevent dangerous concentrations that enable predatory behavior. The focus on sustainability requires long-term thinking that naturally promotes consideration of community welfare over individual short-term gain. Similar patterns emerge in other communities that have successfully maintained human-centered economic models. Worker-owned cooperatives show different behavioral patterns than hierarchical corporations. Community-supported agriculture creates different relationships between producers and consumers than industrial food systems. Local currency systems promote different values than global financial markets oriented around abstract profit maximization. These alternative economic models aren't just theoretical possibilities. They're functioning demonstrations that different organizational structures can promote empathetic human connection rather than predatory exploitation. They show that the psychological conditions leading to Wendigo transformation aren't inevitable consequences of human nature, but results of specific environmental factors that can be changed through intentional community design. Dr. Eleanor Ostrom, whose Nobel Prize-winning research into common resource management challenged the assumption that humans inevitably exploit shared resources, documented hundreds of communities that have successfully maintained cooperative management of forests, fisheries, and other environmental resources for centuries without experiencing the tragedy of the commons that economists assumed was inevitable. Her analysis revealed that successful resource-sharing communities consistently implement what she called design principles that mirror the protective factors identified in traditional Indigenous practices for preventing psychological breakdown. These include clearly defined community boundaries, collective decision-making processes, graduated sanctions for rule violations, and mechanisms for conflict resolution that maintain community cohesion rather than creating permanent divisions. Most importantly, these communities develop strong social norms that prioritize long-term community welfare over individual short-term gain. Members learn to think in terms of generational impacts rather than immediate benefits, creating cognitive frameworks that naturally resist the short-sighted thinking that characterizes Wendigo psychology. But Ostrom's research also revealed how easily these protective social structures can be undermined by external pressures. Communities that had maintained cooperative resource management for centuries could be rapidly transformed into competitive and exploitative systems through the introduction of market-based incentives, government regulations that individualized previously collective resources, or cultural influences that promoted individual achievement over community welfare. The speed of transformation was often shocking. Communities that had successfully resisted internal pressures toward exploitation for generations could be completely reorganized within a few years when external systems began rewarding individual accumulation over collective stewardship. The change wasn't just economic, it was psychological. Community members, who had previously demonstrated strong empathetic connections and cooperative behaviors, began exhibiting individualistic and competitive attitudes that mirrored broader cultural patterns. This vulnerability of cooperative communities to external corruption provides crucial insight into the mechanisms driving modern Wendigo epidemics. Even communities that successfully maintain internal protective factors can be overwhelmed by broader social systems that systematically reward predatory behavior while punishing empathetic cooperation. The implications are sobering. Individual communities can create and maintain psychological environments that promote human flourishing, but they remain vulnerable to transformation if the broader cultural context continues to reward Wendigo-like behaviors. Lasting protection requires addressing the systemic factors that create conditions for transformation across entire societies. This brings us to perhaps the most challenging aspect of preventing modern Wendigo epidemics: the need for coordinated intervention across multiple social domains simultaneously. Unlike historical cases that affected isolated communities, modern transformations operate through interconnected global systems that can overwhelm local protective measures. Consider how global economic pressures can force even well-intentioned organizations to adopt predatory practices. Companies that prioritize employee welfare and environmental sustainability may find themselves unable to compete with organizations willing to externalize social and environmental costs. Political leaders who maintain empathetic connection to all constituents may be defeated by opponents willing to exploit tribal divisions and dehumanizing rhetoric. The systemic nature of modern Wendigo conditions requires systemic solutions. Individual virtue and local community action, while necessary, are insufficient when surrounded by global systems that systematically reward psychological transformation while punishing empathetic human connection. But systemic change begins with understanding the mechanisms through which Wendigo psychology spreads and the intervention points where its transmission can be interrupted. Just as public health measures can prevent the spread of infectious diseases, social health measures could potentially prevent the spread of psychological pathologies that undermine human community and cooperation. Dr. Nicholas Christakis, whose research into social network effects has revealed how behaviors spread through communities, has identified what he calls social contagion mechanisms that operate according to predictable patterns. Behaviors spread most rapidly through networks when they're modeled by high-status individuals, when they're rewarded by social systems, and when they provide apparent solutions to shared problems or stresses. Applied to Wendigo psychology, this suggests that interventions should focus on ensuring that high-status positions are occupied by individuals who model empathetic behavior, redesigning reward systems to incentivize cooperation over exploitation, and providing alternative solutions to the genuine problems that make predatory behaviors seem attractive. The first intervention point requires fundamental changes in how societies select leaders across all social domains. Instead of rewarding individuals who demonstrate willingness to exploit others for personal gain, selection processes should identify and promote those who show exceptional capacity for empathetic connection and community service. This isn't just idealistic thinking, it's practical necessity. Communities led by individuals with psychopathic traits consistently show worse long-term outcomes than those led by empathetic leaders. The short-term competitive advantages gained through exploitation are overwhelmed by the long-term costs of social breakdown, environmental destruction, and psychological pathology. Traditional Indigenous communities understood this principle and developed elaborate leadership selection processes that identified individuals with exceptional capacity for wisdom, empathy, and service to community welfare. Modern research supports the effectiveness of these traditional approaches, but implementing them requires overcoming systems that currently reward the opposite characteristics. The second intervention point involves redesigning reward systems across economic, political, and social institutions to incentivize behaviors that strengthen rather than weaken community bonds. This requires moving beyond purely competitive models toward what researchers call cooperative competition, where individual success is measured by contribution to collective welfare rather than ability to exploit others. Some organizations and communities have begun implementing such changes with promising results. Companies that measure success through triple bottom line accounting that includes social and environmental impact alongside financial returns show different behavioral patterns than those focused solely on profit maximization. Political systems that incorporate citizen deliberation and consensus building show less polarization than those organized around zero-sum competition between opposing factions. The third intervention point involves addressing the underlying conditions of isolation, meaninglessness, and scarcity that make Wendigo transformations seem like rational responses to impossible circumstances. This requires creating social environments that provide genuine alternatives to predatory survival strategies. Communities that successfully maintain human dignity under stress typically share several characteristics. They provide multiple sources of meaning and identity beyond individual achievement. They maintain social safety nets that ensure basic needs are met without requiring exploitative behavior. They create regular opportunities for cooperative activity that reinforces empathetic connections between community members. Most importantly, they maintain cultural narratives that frame challenges as opportunities for collective problem-solving rather than individual competition for scarce resources. The stories communities tell about themselves and their challenges profoundly influence how individuals understand their options and possibilities. Dr. Jerome Bruner, whose research into narrative psychology revealed the power of stories to shape behavior, argued that humans are fundamentally storytelling creatures who understand themselves and their world through the narratives they inherit and create. Communities that maintain empathetic, cooperative cultures typically have story traditions that emphasize interconnection, mutual responsibility, and the possibility of transformation through collective action. In contrast, communities that develop predatory, competitive cultures often have story traditions that emphasize individual struggle, zero-sum competition, and the inevitability of exploitation. These narrative frameworks create cognitive conditions that make Wendigo-type transformations seem not just acceptable, but necessary for survival. The power of narrative to shape behavior suggests that preventing modern Wendigo epidemics may require conscious effort to create and spread alternative stories that frame human challenges in terms that promote cooperation rather than predation. This isn't just about changing individual beliefs, but about transforming the cultural software that shapes how entire communities understand reality and possibility. Indigenous communities maintained psychological health for thousands of years, partly through sophisticated storytelling traditions that regularly reinforced empathetic connection and community cooperation. Their stories weren't just entertainment, but psychological technology that maintained cognitive frameworks supporting human dignity and mutual care. Modern societies have largely abandoned these traditional narrative technologies in favor of stories that promote individual competition and consumption. The dominant cultural narratives in most developed nations frame success in terms of individual accumulation and competitive advantage over others, creating cognitive conditions that naturally lead toward Wendigo psychology. But alternative narratives remain possible. Throughout human history, communities facing existential challenges have created stories that enabled collective responses to seemingly impossible circumstances. The same narrative creativity that once helped communities survive famines, wars, and environmental disasters could potentially help us address the psychological epidemics threatening our modern world. The question is whether we can create and spread empathetic narratives faster than predatory narratives spread through our interconnected communication systems. The same digital technologies that currently amplify dehumanizing content could potentially be used to promote stories that strengthen rather than weaken human community bonds. Some communities and organizations have begun experimenting with what researchers call regenerative storytelling, creating narratives that explicitly promote empathetic connection and cooperative problem-solving. These efforts remain small-scale compared to the massive systems promoting competitive and predatory narratives, but they demonstrate that alternative approaches are possible. The challenge is scaling up these narrative interventions to match the reach and influence of systems currently promoting Wendigo psychology. This requires coordinated effort across multiple communication platforms and social institutions to create cultural conditions that naturally promote empathetic human connection rather than predatory exploitation. But such efforts face powerful opposition from systems that profit from psychological transformation. Industries built around exploiting human insecurities, political movements that gain power through dehumanizing opponents, and economic structures that concentrate wealth through extractive practices all have vested interests in maintaining conditions that promote Wendigo psychology. The result is what researchers call manufactured pathology, the systematic creation of psychological conditions that serve particular economic and political interests while undermining human flourishing. The same mechanisms that once created individual Wendigo transformations are now being deliberately deployed to create psychological conditions that benefit those who have already undergone transformation themselves. This suggests that preventing modern Wendigo epidemics may require more than just creating alternative systems and narratives. It may require direct confrontation with systems that profit from human psychological breakdown and the individuals who control those systems. But such confrontation becomes complicated when many of the individuals operating these systems have themselves undergone psychological transformations that make them incapable of recognizing the harm they're causing. They aren't consciously choosing evil. They're operating from cognitive frameworks that no longer recognize other humans as subjects worthy of moral consideration. This brings us back to the fundamental insight embedded in traditional Wendigo stories. The monster isn't something external that can be defeated through force or cleverness. It's something internal that emerges when humans cross certain psychological thresholds. Fighting it requires understanding not just its external manifestations, but the internal conditions that allow it to emerge and spread. The ancient wisdom suggests that the most effective intervention isn't fighting the monster directly, but creating conditions that prevent its emergence in the first place. This means focusing on the social, economic, and cultural factors that either promote or prevent the psychological transformations that create monsters. Such prevention requires long-term thinking that prioritizes community mental health over short-term individual advantage. It requires understanding that human psychological well-being isn't just an individual concern, but a collective necessity for maintaining civilization itself. The communities that successfully resisted historical Wendigo outbreaks understood this principle and organized their entire social systems around preventing the conditions that led to transformation. Their economic systems distributed resources in ways that prevented dangerous scarcity. Their political systems distributed power in ways that prevented dangerous concentration. Their cultural systems maintained narratives that promoted empathetic connection and mutual responsibility. Most importantly, they understood that preventing psychological breakdown required ongoing community effort rather than individual treatment after transformation had already occurred. They invested in creating and maintaining social environments that naturally promoted psychological health, rather than trying to fix individuals after they had been damaged toward a different approach to addressing by toxic conditions. This understanding points modern Wendigo epidemics. Instead of focusing primarily on treating individuals who have already undergone transformation, efforts should concentrate on creating social conditions that prevent transformation from occurring in the first place. Such prevention requires fundamental changes in how modern societies organize economic activity, distribute power, and create meaning. But the alternative, as the ancient stories make clear, is the gradual transformation of human communities into something that consumes without conscience, competes without compassion, and succeeds without soul. The choice between transformation and preservation remains before us, but the window for making it grows smaller each year. The exponential dynamics that drive epidemic spread work in both directions, but they favor whatever pattern gains early dominance. If predatory behaviors continue to spread faster than empathetic ones, we may reach a tipping point where transformation becomes irreversible. But the same exponential dynamics that threaten to consume us could potentially save us if we can mobilize sufficient collective will to choose empathetic connection over predatory exploitation. The question is whether we can recognize the stakes involved and act accordingly before the choice is made for us by systems and individuals who have already crossed the threshold into something else. The forest remembers. The old stories hold truths we've forgotten at our peril. And somewhere in the space between ancient wisdom and modern crisis, the possibility of redemption flickers like firelight against an encroaching darkness that grows bolder with each passing day. The Wendigo waits with infinite patience, knowing that time itself serves its purpose. Every day we fail to act, every moment we choose comfort over courage, every decision to look away rather than see clearly feeds the growing shadow of our own potential for transformation. But the light hasn't gone out yet. The fire still burns in scattered communities that remember what it means to be human. The question is whether there's enough time left to tend that flame back to brightness, or whether we'll watch it flicker and fade until only darkness remains. In the end, the most terrifying truth about the Wendigo isn't that it exists, it's that it's patient enough to let us choose our own transformation, clever enough to make that choice seem like wisdom, and hungry enough to wait as long as necessary for us to feed ourselves to its endless appetite. The ancient terror has learned to wear modern faces, speak in contemporary voices, and promise everything we think we want. It no longer needs to hunt us through frozen forests. We come to it willingly, eagerly, convinced we're pursuing success when we're actually embracing our own consumption. And in that willing embrace lies both our greatest danger and our last hope. Because as long as we retain the capacity to choose, the possibility of choosing differently remains. The question is whether we're still human enough to recognize what we're choosing between, and brave enough to choose the harder path that leads back toward the light. The Wendigo knows our answer before we do. It has seen this choice made countless times throughout history, in forests, both literal and metaphorical. It knows the seductive power of transformation, the intoxicating promise of freedom from empathy's burden, the relief of treating others as objects rather than subjects. But it also knows something else. It knows that some communities, some individuals, some spark of human wisdom has always chosen differently, has always found ways to maintain empathy in the face of systems designed to destroy it, has always remembered that the true measure of human success isn't what we can take from others, but what we can give to them. That knowledge makes the ancient terror patient, but it also makes it afraid. Because as long as that spark exists, as long as even one community remembers how to choose empathy over exploitation, the possibility remains that the fire could spread faster than the darkness, that healing could prove more contagious than consumption, that humanity could choose to remain human despite every pressure to become something else. The choice is ours. It has always been ours, and it remains ours still, for as long as we remain capable of making it. The question is, what will we choose? But the choice isn't made in grand gestures or heroic moments. It's made in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the pause before we speak, in the decision to see the person serving our coffee as a human being, rather than a service delivery mechanism. It's made every time we choose to listen, rather than simply wait for our turn to talk. Every time we resist the algorithmic pull toward outrage and division. Every time we remember that the stranger across from us carries the same capacity for joy and suffering that we do. The modern Wendigo feeds on these small surrenders, these tiny moments when we allow convenience to override compassion, efficiency to trump empathy, success to silence our souls. It doesn't need us to commit dramatic acts of evil. It simply needs us to stop seeing each other clearly, to begin treating human relationships as transactions, to gradually forget that other people are as real and complex as we are. Dr. Emmanuel Levinas, a philosopher who survived the Holocaust and spent his life trying to understand how humans could systematically dehumanize each other, identified what he called the fundamental ethical encounter. It occurs, he argued, when we truly see another person's face, not as a collection of features or a representative of some category, but as a window into another consciousness as profound and mysterious as our own. This moment of recognition, Levinas claimed, is the foundation of all human ethics. It's the moment when exploitation becomes impossible, because we can no longer pretend that the other person isn't real. It's the moment when the Wendigo transformation stops, because the hunger that drives it depends on our ability to reduce others to objects that exist for our consumption. But modern life systematically prevents these moments of recognition. We interact with others through screens that flatten them into profiles and avatars. We navigate social environments where everyone wears professional masks designed to hide their humanity. We participate in economic systems where human labor is abstracted into metrics and efficiency calculations that obscure the actual people whose lives are affected by our decisions. The result is what researchers call empathy erosion, a gradual wearing away of our capacity to recognize and respond to others' humanity. It doesn't happen all at once, like the dramatic transformations described in traditional Wendigo accounts. Instead, it occurs through thousands of small compromises, tiny moments when we choose the easier path of treating others as things rather than beings. Consider the executive who stops learning the names of employees after the company reaches a certain size, the politician who begins speaking about constituents as demographics rather than individuals, the social media user who gradually becomes more comfortable making cruel comments about strangers because they never have to see the impact of their words. Each choice seems small, rational, even necessary given the circumstances, but accumulated over time, these choices create neural pathways that make empathetic connection increasingly difficult and predatory behavior increasingly automatic. The brain, always seeking efficiency, learns to process other humans as objects because that's the pattern we've reinforced through repeated behavior. Eventually, the capacity for genuine empathetic recognition atrophies through disuse, leaving behind cognitive architecture that mirrors the transformed state described in historical Wendigo accounts. Dr. Tanya Singer, whose neuroscience research has mapped the brain networks involved in empathetic response, has documented this process in real time through brain imaging studies. Individuals who regularly engage in dehumanizing behaviors show measurable changes in neural activity patterns, particularly in regions responsible for emotional resonance and perspective taking. The changes aren't immediately permanent, Singer's research reveals. In early stages, empathetic capacity can be restored through practices that reactivate dormant neural pathways. Meditation techniques that focus on loving kindness toward others can literally regrow brain tissue in areas responsible for emotional connection. Volunteer work that involves direct service to people in need can reverse some of the neural damage caused by prolonged engagement in dehumanizing activities. But there appears to be a threshold beyond which restoration becomes increasingly difficult. Individuals who have engaged in systematic exploitation of others for extended periods show brain changes that resist reversal, even with intensive therapeutic intervention. The neural architecture of empathy becomes so degraded that recognizing others' humanity requires conscious effort that most people find unsustainable over time. This neurological understanding reframes the traditional Wendigo stories in startling ways. The point of no return described in Indigenous accounts may reflect accurate observations of real psychological thresholds. Once certain neural pathways have been sufficiently damaged, the individual may indeed become incapable of returning to normal empathetic functioning, regardless of their conscious intentions or the interventions attempted by their community. But the research also reveals something hopeful. The threshold isn't crossed suddenly or inevitably. There are warning signs, intervention points, and protective factors that can prevent progression to irreversible transformation. The key is recognizing the signs early enough to implement effective countermeasures. The earliest warning sign, consistent across both historical accounts and modern research, is what psychologists call moral numbing. Individuals begin to report feeling less emotional response to situations that previously would have triggered strong empathetic reactions. They describe making decisions that harm others without experiencing the guilt or remorse they would have felt in the past. Initially, this numbing may be experienced as a relief from emotional burden, a welcome efficiency that allows focus on practical matters without being distracted by others' suffering. But it represents the beginning of a process that can lead to complete empathetic breakdown if allowed to continue unchecked. The second warning sign is increasing social isolation, not necessarily physical, but emotional. Individuals begin to feel disconnected from others, even when surrounded by people. They report that relationships feel shallow or transactional, that genuine emotional intimacy becomes difficult to achieve or maintain. They may withdraw from activities that previously provided meaningful social connection. The third warning sign is the development of justification systems that explain away behavior that violates previously held moral standards. Individuals begin creating elaborate rationales for actions they would have condemned in others, often using language that frames exploitation as necessary pragmatism or competitive advantage. These warning signs typically appear in sequence, each one making the next more likely. Moral numbing makes social isolation easier to tolerate. Social isolation makes justification systems more necessary to maintain self-image, and justification systems make further moral numbing seem rational and appropriate. But the progression isn't automatic or inevitable. At each stage, intervention remains possible if individuals or communities recognize what's happening and implement appropriate countermeasures. The challenge is that the very cognitive changes that signal developing transformation also make recognition and intervention less likely. Individuals experiencing moral numbing are less likely to recognize their condition as problematic. Those becoming socially isolated are less likely to seek help or accept intervention from others. Those developing justification systems are less likely to acknowledge the validity of external moral feedback. This is why traditional Indigenous communities developed community-based intervention systems, rather than relying on individuals to recognize and address their own psychological breakdown. They understood that transformation typically involves loss of insight as well as loss of empathy, making self-correction increasingly unlikely as the condition progresses. Modern intervention strategies based on individual therapy or self-help approaches often fail because they assume individuals retain the capacity for accurate self-assessment and voluntary behavior change throughout the transformation process. But research reveals that these capacities are precisely what become impaired as empathetic breakdown progresses. Effective intervention requires external recognition of warning signs combined with community-based support systems that can provide alternative sources of meaning, connection, and identity when individual psychological resources become compromised. This is why isolated individuals are far more vulnerable to Wendigo-type transformations than those embedded in strong social networks. But modern life systematically undermines the community connections that historically provided protection against psychological breakdown. Geographic mobility, economic pressures, and digital communication systems all tend to weaken the stable, long-term relationships that enable communities to recognize warning signs and implement effective interventions. The result is epidemic levels of individuals progressing through early stages of empathetic breakdown without triggering community alarm systems that might prevent further deterioration. By the time transformation becomes obvious to others, it may have progressed beyond the point where intervention is likely to succeed. This understanding suggests that preventing modern Wendigo epidemics requires rebuilding community capacity for early recognition and intervention, rather than focusing primarily on treating individuals after transformation has already occurred. Communities need to develop systems for monitoring members' psychological well-being, recognizing warning signs, and providing support before crisis situations develop. Some communities have begun implementing such systems with promising results. Religious congregations that train members to recognize signs of spiritual distress and provide appropriate support show lower rates of various psychological pathologies. Workplace organizations that implement peer support programs and regular check-ins about employee well-being show reduced rates of burnout and antisocial behavior. Neighborhood associations that create regular opportunities for social connection and mutual support show greater resilience during economic and social stresses that typically trigger individual psychological breakdown. The common factor across successful programs is proactive community engagement that prevents isolation and provides early intervention before problems become severe. But scaling up these community-based approaches requires overcoming structural features of modern life that systematically undermine community formation and maintenance. Economic systems that require frequent relocation for career advancement make stable community relationships difficult to develop. Work schedules that consume most waking hours leave little time for community engagement. Housing patterns that separate people into isolated single-family units reduce opportunities for informal social monitoring and support. These structural barriers to community formation aren't accidental. They emerge from economic and political systems that benefit from having populations of isolated individuals who are easier to manipulate and exploit than communities of connected people who can provide mutual support and collective resistance. The same systems that profit from Wendigo transformations also profit from the social isolation that makes such transformations more likely. Industries built around individual consumption require consumers who lack strong community ties that might provide alternative sources of meaning and identity. Political systems that depend on manipulating fear and division require populations that lack the social cohesion necessary for collaborative problem solving. This creates what researchers call a pathological feedback loop, where systems that benefit from psychological breakdown actively undermine the community connections that could prevent such breakdown. The result is accelerating rates of transformation that serve particular economic and political interests, while devastating human psychological well-being. Breaking this cycle requires recognizing that individual mental health and community social health are inseparable. Efforts to address psychological pathologies without addressing the social conditions that create them are likely to fail because they treat symptoms while leaving underlying causes intact. But addressing social conditions requires coordinated action by communities that may themselves be compromised by the very problems they need to solve. Communities weakened by isolation and empathetic breakdown may lack the collective capacity to implement the changes necessary to restore psychological health. This is the central paradox facing efforts to prevent modern Wendigo epidemics. The communities most needing intervention may be least capable of recognizing their need or organizing effective responses. The individuals most needing help may be least capable of seeking or accepting it. The social systems most needing change may be most resistant to modification. But the paradox isn't absolute. Throughout history, communities facing seemingly impossible challenges have found ways to mobilize collective resources for survival and renewal. The same human capacity for cooperation and mutual aid that created civilization in the first place remains available to address the crises that threaten to destroy it. The key is understanding that transformation works in both directions. Just as empathetic breakdown can cascade through social networks, empathetic restoration can spread through communities when conditions support it. The same psychological mechanisms that drive pathological contagion can potentially drive healing contagion if properly channeled. Dr. James Fowler, whose research into social network effects has revealed how behaviors spread through communities, has identified what he calls positive contagion cascades, where pro-social behaviors become self-reinforcing and spread exponentially through populations. Acts of kindness, cooperation, and mutual aid can trigger similar behaviors in others, creating upward spirals that strengthen community bonds and individual psychological well-being. But positive cascades require different conditions than negative ones. While pathological behaviors can spread through weak social connections and minimal contact, pro-social behaviors typically require stronger relationships and more sustained interaction to achieve transmission. This means that rebuilding empathetic community connections requires more intentional effort than allowing them to deteriorate. The communities most successful at preventing and reversing psychological breakdown share certain characteristics that facilitate positive contagion. They create regular opportunities for meaningful face-to-face interaction between community members. They establish shared activities that require cooperation and mutual support. They maintain cultural practices that regularly affirm human dignity and interconnection. Most importantly, they develop what researchers call collective efficacy, the shared belief that community members can work together to solve problems and improve conditions for everyone. This psychological resource appears to be crucial for mobilizing the sustained effort required to prevent and reverse Wendigo-type transformations. Communities with high collective efficacy show remarkable resilience in the face of economic stress, social disruption, and other conditions that typically trigger individual psychological breakdown. They're able to maintain empathetic connections and cooperative behaviors, even under circumstances that cause other communities to fragment into competing individuals focused solely on personal survival. But collective efficacy isn't something that emerges automatically from bringing people together. It requires conscious cultivation through practices and institutions that build trust, demonstrate the effectiveness of cooperation, and create shared identity around mutual well-being rather than individual achievement. Traditional Indigenous communities develop sophisticated technologies for building and maintaining collective efficacy. Their governance systems ensured that all community members had voice in important decisions. Their economic systems distributed resources in ways that prevented dangerous inequality. Their cultural systems maintained narratives that emphasized interdependence and shared responsibility. Modern communities can learn from these traditional approaches, but they must adapt them to contemporary conditions characterized by rapid change, technological complexity, and global interconnection. The challenge is maintaining the essential features of community-based psychological protection while scaling them up to address modern conditions. Some communities have begun this adaptation process with encouraging results. Co-housing developments that combine private living spaces with shared common areas and collective decision-making show different social dynamics than conventional neighborhoods. Worker cooperatives that distribute ownership and control among employees show different psychological profiles than hierarchical corporations. Community land trusts that maintain affordable housing through collective ownership show greater stability than areas subject to speculative real estate markets. These alternative organizational models demonstrate that different structural arrangements can promote psychological health rather than pathology. But they remain small-scale experiments compared to the massive systems promoting Wendigo transformations across global society. Scaling up protective community models requires overcoming powerful resistance from systems that profit from psychological breakdown and social fragmentation. It requires political action to change policies that undermine community formation. It requires economic action to create alternative systems that prioritize human well-being over profit maximization. It requires cultural action to change narratives that promote individual competition over collective cooperation. But perhaps most importantly, it requires personal action by individuals who choose to prioritize empathetic connection over personal advancement, community well-being over individual success, long-term sustainability over short-term gain. These choices may seem small compared to the magnitude of the challenges we face, but they create the social conditions necessary for larger changes to become possible. Every time we choose to see another person clearly, rather than reducing them to their function or category, we strengthen neural pathways that resist Wendigo transformation. Every time we prioritize relationship over transaction, we create social bonds that can provide mutual support during difficult times. Every time we act from empathy rather than self-interest, we model behaviors that can spread through social networks and influence others. These individual choices become collective transformation when enough people make them consistently over time. The same exponential dynamics that drive pathological breakdown can drive psychological healing when sufficient numbers of people choose empathetic connection over predatory exploitation. But the window for making these choices may be narrowing. The systems promoting Wendigo transformations continue to grow more sophisticated and pervasive. The social conditions that historically protected against psychological breakdown continue to erode. The cognitive infrastructure necessary for recognizing and choosing alternatives continues to deteriorate under sustained assault from systems designed to undermine human empathetic capacity. The ancient stories remind us that some transformations, once completed, are irreversible. Communities that waited too long to recognize and address Wendigo outbreaks sometimes found that intervention was no longer possible, that the psychological infection had progressed beyond the point where healing could occur. We may be approaching similar thresholds in our modern context. If current trends continue, we may reach tipping points where empathetic breakdown becomes so widespread that communities lose the capacity to recognize or address their own psychological dysfunction. The normalized predation that characterizes increasing areas of modern life may become so entrenched that alternatives become literally unthinkable. But the stories also remind us that the choice remains available as long as we retain the capacity to make it. As long as some spark of human wisdom persists, the possibility of choosing differently remains. The question is whether we can recognize what we're choosing between quickly enough to prevent the choice from being made for us by systems that have already crossed the threshold into something else. The forest still remembers. The old wisdom still flickers in communities scattered across our fractured world. The possibility of remaining human still exists, though it requires more conscious effort and intentional choice than ever before in human history. The Wendigo waits with infinite patience, knowing that time serves its purpose, but it also knows something that gives it pause. It knows that humans, at their best, are capable of choosing the harder path that leads away from easy consumption and toward difficult connection. It knows that some communities, some individuals, some stubborn spark of empathetic wisdom has always found ways to resist transformation, even under the most extreme circumstances. That knowledge makes the ancient terror confident but not certain, because as long as the capacity for empathetic choice exists, the outcome remains undetermined. As long as some humans remember how to see each other clearly, the fire of human connection can potentially spread faster than the shadow of predatory consumption. The choice is ours, moment by moment, breath by breath, encounter by encounter. What will we choose? The answer lies not in grand proclamations or heroic gestures, but in the accumulated weight of 10,000 small decisions. In the breath we take before responding to the person who cuts us off in traffic. In the choice to put down our phone and actually listen when someone is speaking to us. In the moment we decide whether to see the cashier at the grocery store as a human being with hopes and fears and dreams, or simply as a mechanism for completing our transaction. These micro moments of choice ripple outward in ways we rarely recognize or understand. The executive who takes time to learn the name of the janitor creates a small crack in the corporate armor of dehumanization. The teacher who sees the struggling student as a complete person rather than a test score plants seeds that may bloom decades later. The parent who chooses patience over efficiency in dealing with their child's emotional needs builds neural pathways that resist transformation in the next generation. But the cumulative power of these choices only becomes apparent when we understand how profoundly our brains change in response to repeated patterns of behavior. Neuroscientist Dr. Rick Hanson has documented what he calls experience-dependent neuroplasticity, the brain's tendency to strengthen neural pathways that we use repeatedly while allowing unused pathways to atrophy. Every time we choose empathy over exploitation, we literally reshape our neural architecture in ways that make future empathetic choices easier and more automatic. Conversely, every time we choose the easier path of treating others as objects or obstacles, we strengthen neural patterns that make such choices increasingly natural and rewarding. The brain doesn't distinguish between small compromises and large ones. It simply reinforces whatever patterns we practice most consistently. This means that the accumulation of seemingly minor dehumanizing choices can create major psychological transformations over time. The implications are both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying because they reveal how easily we can slide into Wendigo consciousness through choices that seem insignificant in isolation. Hopeful because they suggest that conscious practice of empathetic awareness can literally rebuild our capacity for human connection, even after it has been damaged by prolonged exposure to dehumanizing environments. Dr. Daniel Siegel's research into mindsight, the ability to see the internal world of self and others, has shown that this crucial capacity can be developed through practice, even in adults who never developed it properly during childhood. Individuals who have lost the ability to recognize others as complex internal beings can regain that capacity through sustained effort and appropriate support. But the practice required isn't passive or automatic. It requires what Siegel calls mindful awareness, the conscious decision to pay attention to our own internal states and those of others. It requires recognizing when we're beginning to treat someone as an object rather than a subject, and making the deliberate choice to shift our perception back towards seeing their full humanity. This kind of mindful empathy is exhausting in environments designed to discourage it. Modern workplaces that measure human productivity in algorithmic terms make it cognitively expensive to maintain awareness of co-workers as complete people. Social media platforms that reduce human complexity to profiles and metrics create mental fatigue when we try to remember that each username represents someone as real and complicated as ourselves. The cognitive load of maintaining empathetic awareness in dehumanizing environments helps explain why Wendigo transformations often begin with well-intentioned people who simply become overwhelmed by the effort required to see clearly. The corporate executive who starts out caring about employees but gradually stops learning their names because the company has grown too large. The politician who begins with genuine concern for constituents but slowly shifts towards seeing them as demographic categories because individual relationships don't scale to electoral success. These aren't necessarily bad people choosing evil. They're often good people making understandable accommodations to impossible circumstances. But the accommodations accumulate over time, each compromise making the next one easier until the capacity for genuine empathetic connection has been eroded beyond recognition. The Wendigo has never been just a monster in the woods. It has always been a mirror, reflecting back to us our own capacity for transformation when we lose sight of what makes us human. In the frozen forests of the past and the digital wilderness of today, the ancient hunger remains the same, waiting patiently for us to feed it through our choices, our compromises, and our willingness to see others as less than ourselves. But the old stories don't end with despair. They end with a choice that each generation must make anew. The choice between consumption and connection, between predation and empathy, between becoming the monster or remaining recognizably human. That choice still belongs to us. Carved into every moment, we decide how to see the person standing before us. The question isn't whether the Wendigo is real. The question is whether we still are.